The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities that they represent. This program is intended for educational purposes. You're listening to
आप सुन रहे हैं
You're listening to
നിങ്ങൾ കേൾക്കുന്നത്
ನೀವು ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀರಾ ರೇಡಿಯೋ
Azim Premji
ಯೂನಿವರ್ಸಿಟಿ
Hello and welcome to What About Science on Radio Azim Premji University. I'm Nandita Jayaraj, and this is a podcast where we try to make sense of the science making news in today's world, and also the science that's set to make news in the future. What I want to do in this episode is to get to the bottom of all the fuss around Neanderthal DNA. A few months back, many of us woke up to a rather bizarre headline. Medicine Nobel goes to Neanderthal researcher Svante Paabo. Don't be confused. Svante Paabo isn't a Neanderthal, obviously. He's very much a Homo sapiens like you and me. But unlike you and me, he won the 2022 Nobel Prize in the Physiology and Medicine category for his discoveries concerning the genomes of extinct hominins and human evolution.
The Nobel Assembly at Karolinska Institutet has today decided to award the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine to Svante Paabo for his discoveries concerning the genomes of extinct hominins.
Now, Paabo may have won the prize, but no discovery is the result of a single scientist alone. So it was definitely with the help of his team that he made these discoveries. And one of the biggest of their accomplishments is to be the first to sequence the genome of a Neanderthal individual. And this was a woman who lived in Siberia over 40,000 years ago. Now, you don't have to be a scientist for this discovery to blow your mind. After all, we know very little about what the world looked like beyond a couple of thousand years ago. And any clues about ancient extinct species immediately gets us excited. It doesn't matter if it's humans or dinosaurs or dodos. I don't know about you, but I'm very curious about what kind of lives our extinct hominin cousins led. Where did they live? What kind of relationships did they have? And of course, what did they look like? I feel like maybe if we knew more about this, I'd be able to understand why modern humans behave or misbehave the way we do. Did ancient humans also think that they were invincible like we do? And how did they go extinct? If they went extinct, could we go extinct? To make sure I don't get carried away, I've invited a very special guest to the show. Shweta Ramdas is a computational geneticist here at Azim Premji University. One of Shweta's areas of interest is genetic variation in human populations, and that makes her really the ideal person to break down this discovery for us. Thank you so much for being here, Shweta.
I'm really glad to be talking about this. It's an exciting year for genetics.
So, Shweta, can you first tell us what you know about Neanderthals? Is it correct for me to think of them as ancestors of modern humans? And also, why don't they exist anymore?
Yeah, so Neanderthals were not our ancestors. I think one of the things we think about as soon as we think about evolution is that picture of monkey sort of crouching, then slowly standing up, and then standing up a little bit more, and then becoming man. And because we think of it as this linear progression, we tend to think of any species that don't exist today as our ancestors. Neanderthals were more likely our cousins. They're what we call ancient humans or archaic humans. They're extinct, so they don't live right now. And how we know they existed is because we discovered a Neanderthal fossil sometime maybe about a century ago and have discovered more since then. If you look at these fossils, if you look at a skull, you would think, well, yeah, they look human, but not quite human. You know, their foreheads are a little more elongated. Their skulls are much larger, so they had larger brains. Their brows are more protruding. So at some point, a bunch of researchers decided that they looked enough unlike humans to be a different species. And so they were christened a new species called Homo neanderthalensis. And sometimes they're also called Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, because there is an existing debate about whether are Neanderthals a separate species or are they a subspecies, in the sense that our modern humans and Neanderthals will be part of the same species, with the differences between these two being sort of more minute. So Neanderthals went extinct about 40,000 years ago, and it's very interesting because we, again, sort of going back to that image that we have of progression, of linear progression of evolution. We used to think, or the immediate hypothesis was that Neanderthals were a more sort of primitive version of modern humans, and we somehow outcompeted them. We were somehow better, we were more sophisticated, and therefore we survived and they did not. But now with Svante Paabo's research actually contributing to a lot of this, we see bits of Neanderthal DNA in the human genome. So this goes back again to why they may not entirely be a new species. There is a possibility of interbreeding happening between Neanderthals and the ancestors of modern humans. And yeah, so we know that these two species interbred in Europe somewhere between 65,000 and 40,000 years ago. And for reasons that we still don't entirely know for sure, Neanderthals did not survive. There are a bunch of reasons that we can hypothesize, and some of them will come to light in the near future. But for now, we're not entirely sure why sapiens survived and Neanderthals did not.
Can you also tell me a little bit about where they lived in the world, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens? I mean, did they always live in the same geographical areas?
So all hominids, which are what we call human-like species, which include sapiens, Neanderthals, other human species, all of us arose in Africa, right? Africa was the origin of all human-like species in the world. And what has happened since then is waves of migration out of Africa at some at distinct intervals over the history of humans. A small band of humans would gather and move out of Africa to different parts of the world. Neanderthals were the descendants of one wave of migration that happened, hundreds of thousands of years ago, and they primarily settled in Eurasia, so Europe and sort of northern Asia. There are other species as well, denisovans, species that you find in Southeast Asia, but let's talk about Neanderthals for now. And the ancestors of most modern humans that we think about now emerged from Africa about 65 to 70,000 years ago. And that's when our ancestors, or the ancestors of what we call modern humans, interacted with the Neanderthals that had already moved out and had established their own societies in Europe. So that's when the sapiens Neanderthals sort of meeting happened.
I understand that decoding the genome or the DNA of human beings, modern humans, can be, really useful because it can tell us about how diseases work, what is the genetic basis of diseases, and why some people are more prone to, say, diabetes and others are not. And also maybe potentially develop ways to prevent, manage, and maybe even cure a lot of diseases that are untreatable today. But I'm talking about studying modern human DNA. Why are scientists like Svante Paabo going to such extents to try to find out more about the DNA of Neanderthals, which don't exist today? What is really the value in that so much that, the Nobel Committee even awarded them?
So as a scientist, my first answer is perhaps a little divorced from what's useful, in that it's just incredibly interesting. I think as a species, we've always been interested in figuring out how we ended up here. How have we evolved from these single-cell species to form this, a creature that's capable of thought, that's capable of producing machines with extraordinary intelligence, how we've sort of populated the whole world, having emerged from a single continent. And being able to identify stages of this process is fascinating. To be able to trace our history through looking at genome sequences it blows my mind every time I think about it. And before Paabo, the primary way we did this was using fossil records, or by using records, artifacts, cultural artifacts that were left behind by societies. Now, the older back in time you go, the harder it is to find these artifacts. Also, fossil records are one piece of evidence. It's always helpful to complement one kind of evidence with another kind. And our genomes really just carry a very nice record of our history, which, along with fossil records, gives us a very rich picture of the deep history of our species, how we came to be what we are today, which I think is just really fascinating. And you might think of ways we could learn things of interest from these studies. So, for example, our genes, the way our genes function, is always a product of its interactions with the environment. So, for example, humans, modern humans, evolved to digest lactose late into adulthood because we started dairy farming, and it was advantageous to have an allele or a genetic variant that allowed us to digest lactose even beyond childhood. Other mammals don't have this ability. And so, looking at Neanderthals might help us understand what genetic variants did they carry, how did that correlate with the environments they were living in, and help us learn more about these relationships between the genetic material a species carries and the environment it is subject to. The fact that a lot of our genetic material, not a lot of it, but 2% of our genetic material can be traced back to a Neanderthal ancestry helps us study this and ask questions even more pertinent to modern humans. So I think there's a lot of questions that we can ask about the history of our genes by looking at species that don't exist today.
So, Shweta, it sounds kind of impossible. I mean, how do you even get the DNA of Neanderthals with you, and how do you manage to sequence the whole genome? I mean, I'm guessing that is what Paabo did, which really sets him apart from a lot of people who were studying ancient humans. Can you tell us about what and how he managed to do what he did?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head about that was why he won the Nobel, because it was until he came along, it was near impossible to sequence ancient DNA. I mean, now the term genome sequencing is everywhere. Sequencing the genomes of modern humans is just, a piece of cake now. It can be done by devices that are as small as like a USB drive. And, they're taken to the space. The ISS has a little genome sequencer to sequence astronauts and things like that. But yeah, the reason ancient DNA was really hard to sequence is because DNA degrades over time. Like most biological material, it degrades, it's contaminated by bacterial DNA, microorganisms sort of invade these fossils and so on. So because of that degraded nature of DNA, it was close to impossible to sequence ancient DNA. And what Paabo developed was this technique where you could do it. So they specifically look for DNA in the bone marrow of these fossils. So DNA that's protected by a hard casing outside, a hard casing of bone. So the cells inside, or the DNA inside, is protected from bacterial contamination. So that was a big accomplishment. And then the second thing that they did was, well, when you're sequencing ancient DNA, the challenge is that it's very similar to modern human DNA. So that's another kind of contamination. You could contaminate the sample that you're working with your own sample. And so what goes on in their labs is they actually put on these hazmat suits. It's all done in a clean, sterile room where they use UV to first make sure that no human DNA floating around in the room is all degraded, and that's not sequenced by mistake. And then they sort of extract this ancient DNA and sequence it. So these were the main sort of techniques that they established that really allowed us to do this. Before then, we simply could not use genetics to infer the past. So I think the ability to use genetics to add on to what we already know from fossil evidence, from linguistic evidence, did not exist. And now we're able to add on to that, to complement that in a way. One current sort of limitation about this is that ancient DNA tends to remain pristine in colder climates, right? The reason we've been finding Neanderthals, Denisovans, usually from colder parts of the world, is not because ancient humans only lived there, but because those are the fossils we tend to find. Those are the samples that have tended to remain pristine and untouched by hot tropical climates. And so it's been harder to find these in India, for example. But there's people working on it. There's some really cool researchers in India who are also trying very hard to sequence ancient DNA. So I suspect that over the next 5 to 10 years, we'll actually see a lot of stories coming out from India as well.
There's a lot that we associate with Neanderthals, like I guess for many of us who haven't really read about what they were and how they were like, there's an impression that they were not very smart and they were, brutes. And it's not, it wouldn't really be considered as a compliment if someone called you a Neanderthal. So with the added knowledge that we have about them now, and also I found it interesting that you said they actually had bigger brains than us. So what do you make of, a lot of these myths and stereotypes that the word Neanderthal brings to our minds?
The short answer is I don't know. But a lot of these myths were created based on what, again, that linear progression of evolution. We existed, they didn't, and therefore we are better. Neanderthals, I mean, we now suspect that there are cave paintings that have been made by Neanderthals. We're not entirely sure if it was of Neanderthal origin, but there is a suspicion that they were capable of art, capable of music, capable of a lot of the things that we attribute to modern humans alone. And I mean, they were similar enough to modern humans for us to have interbred with them. They were capable enough to have moved to Europe and established societies there for thousands of years. So attributing behavioral traits to a species about which we don't really know anything is a bit presumptuous. And I still don't think we know enough about them to make those conclusions.
Looking at it in isolation and hearing what you've just said, I think it's pretty clear to me why studying genetic variations between human populations is of a lot of value and is naturally grabbing headlines and the big awards. But I think it's also important to talk about how in today's context, when we live in such a biased world, this kind of information has some potential to be misused and misunderstood. I read a lot about this when I read Angela Saini's 2 books called Inferior and Superior, where she talks about how studies of genetic differences between races and genders, for example, can really be used by those who want to perpetuate, and magnify these differences to probably spread a lot of beliefs that aren't so much true. And I think it would be really nice if we could hear from Angela herself about why she feels that such research should be taken up very judiciously and carefully. And there's a clip from The New Scientist where she was interviewed once that I would like to play here.
We have to remember that population geneticists for a long time have already been looking at human variation. They have a huge amount of data. One of the reasons that they do this is because we're politically so interested in it. So we do have a huge amount of research. We have to also remember that social scientists have done a huge amount of research into racial gaps. And when I say racial gaps, I mean gaps arising from discrimination, from the way that society treats people differently. But second, we have to ask ourselves, is it a legitimate question? Is it fair for a scientist to say, in the spirit of inquiry, I should be able to ask whether black people and white people have cognitive differences between them? Now we know, and we've known this for quite a long time, that there is very little biological meaning to the categories white and black. They encompass a huge range of people with a huge amount of difference between them. We know that the majority of human variation, the vast majority, more than 90%, lies within so-called racial groups or population groups. So that is the source of the majority of variation that we can see. So what kind of answers do you expect to get given that those two conditions that you have? Is it really a meaningful and legitimate question? And there are many geneticists who say it isn't. Mark Thomas, for instance, at UCL, who I also interviewed, just thinks it's nonsense. There's no need to group people. Mark Jobling at the University of Leicester, who I also interviewed, said that there's no, grouping is quite arbitrary. It always has been quite arbitrary. From the beginning, it was. There were race scientists early on who divided the world into black, yellow, brown, white, and that was those were their definitions. And to some extent, that's what we still live with. We still use the word Caucasian as though it has it feels scientific. Caucasian, it feels better than white. It has even less biological meaning than any other racial group we use.
Svante Paabo's work itself can be taken as an example. In 2020, he published a paper that suggests that Neanderthals and people with Neanderthal DNA in them had a lower tolerance for pain than other humans. And there was also another recent study that showed that people with Neanderthal DNA were more prone to COVID-19. So there is a fear that such findings could feed into stereotypes that, some races are more tolerant to pain or some races are more immune to COVID-19 and don't need to be vaccinated. So these kind of beliefs, we really saw during the pandemic how harmful they are. So can you tell me if you have thought about this and how you make sense of this when you are also somebody who studies genetic variation?
Yeah, these are really good questions and also really challenging questions, something that human geneticists have contended with right since the field arose. So, the history of human genetics itself has a very gory beginning where the first geneticists were whom we would call eugenicists today. They were interested in how do we eliminate the lack of intelligence from a population, or how do we eliminate what they called idiots from a population? How do we eliminate mental disorders from a population? So unfortunately, the field has not had a very auspicious beginning, and I think most human geneticists today are aware of that and always try to keep their work free from its negative consequences on society. Now, how to do that is a huge challenge and one that I may not have the answer to, and I would love to hear your thoughts as well. So, going back to the question of Svante Paabo's work, and how human genetics can be misused. I think the problem is that the results from a human genetics study are often not controversial by itself. So for example, the same kinds of studies are done in other species, in mice. Let's say you're trying to trace the history of mice over thousands of years, or monkeys. You wouldn't see any controversy. The problem arises when we try and superimpose the concepts of race, or when we try to align what a genetics result gives us with a social construct like race, which somehow over the centuries has become this solid categorization of the human species. What genetics is telling us is that there is no categorization. I could take your genome. There is no part of your genome that can tell me that you're from a particular part of the world. Overall, this collective patterns that I see in your genome would tell me that, you're from a certain part of India, let's say, or that I'm from South India, but there is no one part of my genome that says, aha, this is an African variant, or this is a South Asian variant. And there's a dissonance between these two things, right? That there is no single categorization, but globally, I will be able to look at your genome and say you are most likely to be from South Asia. And this dissonance makes it very easy for racists and in the US or in the West, white supremacists to say, aha, Europeans you look at a genome map, you can see that Europeans cluster differently from Africans, and therefore Europeans are maybe more likely to, like the worst case I've seen has been a journalist saying Europeans are more likely to have some kind of a genetic predisposition for democracy, which is laughable, but this was published and also endorsed by a Nobel laureate. So I guess warning to not take everything that Nobel laureates say for granted. Yeah, but again, going back to what human geneticists should and shouldn't do, should we not ask these questions? I don't know. I'm a researcher and I do see an intrinsic value in just asking questions to which we don't know the answers. But what does one do to mitigate the misuses or the harms that such research could do? I think geneticists need to make sure we communicate these results well. We are more judicious about the terms we use. So one thing that geneticists often do is when we work with different populations, there is value in looking for differences between populations in the sense that I would not want to treat people with very different genetic backgrounds with, let's say, a medical treatment that was personalized for one kind of population. So there is value in the knowledge that if I am from a particular ancestry, I am more likely to have a genetic variant that makes my blood clot faster, and therefore I need to be given a different dose of an anticoagulant, right? So ideally, in an ideal world, this would be done at an individual level, where I could look at your genome and say, okay, you are more likely to clot faster, and therefore I would adjust your dosage. But in the absence of that individualized information, we use genetic ancestry as a proxy. But so there is value in, and that's what geneticists are, I think, trying to capitalize and to use for personalized medicine, to bring genetics into medicine really, or into the clinic. But how does one offset that with genetics definitely being used to bolster existing notions of race and existing notions of differences and hierarchies, is a question that I personally am still grappling with. And I wish I had an answer to it, but I don't.
I think you did touch upon the key, which is communication and, a willingness even among scientists to critique their own work and to engage with these kinds of points of view, which may be critical of the kind of work they do. And I think the more dialogue we have and the more scientists are willing to engage with maybe kind of uncomfortable topics itself is our best bet at moving forward. So thanks for that. So Shweta, before I let you go, I would love to hear more about what you've been working on with your team and if there's anything exciting in the works.
So my work does not have anything to do with Neanderthal DNA, but I do work on genetics of extant populations, specifically individuals in India. So I'm a computational geneticist, and what that means is that I collaborate with clinicians or with geneticists who work very closely with clinicians to look at individuals who have some kind of a disorder and for whom we don't know the cause of this usually severe disorder. And so we sequence their genomes and try and find mutations that are likely responsible for these diseases. That's the broad goal of my research, but also primarily interested in looking at those parts of the genome that lie outside genes. We tend to think of the genome as being made up of genes, but the human genome only actually has 2% of its entire content in genes. The rest of it is what was until recently called the dark matter of the genome, because we simply don't know what it does. And so trying to find out how much of this is functional, how much of this actually helps control genes or switch on or switch off genes, that's the kind of work we're doing.
Thank you so much, Shweta, for this fascinating conversation and for not just explaining to us the wow parts of this topic, but also being willing to muse on some of the difficult questions that science grapples with today. So Shweta, why do you care about science?
In school, I thought that we knew everything about the world. And at some point, I realized that we didn't. And I realized that we actually have the tools to ask questions and find things that we don't know the answers to. And I think there's no other thrill that quite compares. So yeah, that makes science really exciting, to be able to know things that nobody else does.
And that's all we have for you this time. If you want to know more about what we talked about in this episode of What About Science, make sure you don't miss the show notes, where we share links, resources, and acknowledgements just for you.
You're listening to
आप सुन रहे हैं
You're listening to
ನೀವು ಕೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀರಾ
Radio Azim Brainji
University.